February 1942. The fire ladders of the FDNY spring into action at an alarm. At Chelsea, right on the waterfront, something big is burning. As they approach, bells ringing, they can see a great column of smoke reaching high into the sky. Arriving on scene, they're confronted with a giant. The palatial French liner Normandie is on fire. Building fires are one thing, but handling a burning ship is another. Pumping too much water in can make the massive structure, all 80,000 tons of it, roll over. The steel skeleton of the ship can begin to glow with heat. Metal plates can warp and bend, entire decks can collapse. This will be unlike any fire most of the firemen have ever had to deal with before. And as France's pride burns, her designer tries desperately to warn of impending disaster, but he will be ignored. SS Normandie was an icon of the 1930s, sleek, powerful, and above all, luxurious. But war would overtake her glamorous career and see her seized by France's allies for conversion into troopship duties, a conversion that would never be finished. Instead, she would burn, and the story of the fire that destroyed her leaves many questions unanswered to this day. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and as much as it pains me to retell it, this is the story of the blazing inferno that destroyed the SS Normandie. Normandie, a palatial French wonder ship, so grand and spectacular that she became a legend. At the time of her maiden voyage, she was the largest ship in the world, and her innovative hull design, the brainchild of Russian naval architect Vladimir Yurkovich, also made her the fastest. When she steamed into New York for the very first time, an estimated 100,000 people crowded dockside to celebrate her record-breaking transatlantic crossing, in which she'd managed to shave a staggering 10 hours off the time of the previous record holder, the Italian liner Rex. But the Normandie wasn't only built for sheer speed. Her interiors redefined Art Deco elegance with sparkling, fountain-like illuminated columns throughout that earned her the nickname, the Ship of Light. Normandie's first class was an almost overwhelming feast for the senses, from the massive, dramatic gilt panels to the elaborate carvings, floor-to-ceiling artwork, and decor that reflected pure French decadence. In terms of sheer magnificence at sea, there was simply no comparison before or since. For 4 years she reigned the seas, the pinnacle of shipbuilding and the pride of her home country, but tragically, the sparkle of this wonder ship was not to last. The year was 1941, and the world was on the brink of an all-out bloodbath. The rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler's bloody campaign on Europe were casting a heavy pall over the world at large, with no end in sight. During this time, the Atlantic had become the focus of a brutal battle, with the Allies fighting to maintain control of pivotal shipping routes, which had become infested with deadly German U-boats. Ferrying troops across these war-torn waters required large, fast, and sturdy ships capable of outrunning coordinated convoys of U-boats known as wolf packs. Often, the solution was found in the mighty ocean liner. Agile, strong, and capable of carrying thousands of souls across the ocean. Once converted for wartime duties, these luxurious, floating palaces were capable of turning the tides of war. At this point in the conflict, many of the world's most famous liners were caught in limbo, their home countries still debating on how best to use them for the war effort, while others were devising plans to safely retrieve their ships from foreign harbours. Such was the case for the crown jewel of the French fleet, the SS Normandie, which lay mothballed in New York harbour, her crew stripped of their duties, and her future uncertain. When the war had broken out in 1939, she'd been held at her berth at Pier 88 in New York once she had landed there, as it was far too risky to send her home through war-torn waters to a country caught in the crossfires. And so there she waited, the days turning to months. A year passed and the news was going from bad to worse. Normandie's home country of France had finally fallen to the Nazis, and roughly 40% of the country's territory was carved out into a Nazi puppet state known as Vichy France. This left the Normandie and much of the rest of the majestic French fleet of ocean liners with no place to call home, many of them laid up in New York, while the rest were divvied up between the Germans and the Vichy French to repurpose as military transports. It wasn't just the French going without their fleet either. Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, as well as the Aquitania, Bremen and others, joined the Normandie in this early war purgatory in New York City. But slowly and surely, as the war raged on, the Normandie's British and German counterparts were pulled from their berths and sent home for their wartime assignments. But there would be no such luck for the lovely Normandie. She remained mothballed, her skeleton crew bored nearly to tears, her sparkle diminishing under layers of dust. Legally, the Normandie remained in French hands, but it was unknown if or when she would ever reach her next port of call. Now, she was a sitting duck, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before she'd be called up for the war. The only questions were when and for which side. She was known the world over for being a strong, towering, and blisteringly fast ship, and nothing if not a capable seafarer. While still technically the property of her owners, the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or CGT, French line, that company was now in the hands of the Nazi-aligned Vichy French government, casting an ominous shadow over the ship's future. Nervous whispers of sabotage or espionage seemed to be on everyone's lips, especially since the French skeleton crew that remained on board were openly loyal to the Vichy regime. On April 15th, 1941, the FBI intercepted a report written by a German spy by the name of Kurt Ludwig. In the report, written in invisible ink, was the message, "At Pier 88 North is still Normandy." The Germans' intentions behind the message were anyone's guess, but clearly the situation was delicate to say the least. Meanwhile, the Normandie had become a spectacle of the New York waterfront, attracting tourists and onlookers curious to feast their eyes on the Versailles Palace afloat. Almost 3 years since she had last berthed in New York, she remained frozen in time, an almost cruel reminder of the elegance and prosperity of the country that had built her, a country that now she could no longer call home. Then, dawn broke on December 7th, 1941, that day which would live in infamy. With the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States had officially been pulled into the Second World War. Within days, Germany and Italy joined with their ally Japan to declare war on America, and with that, all the great powers of the world were poised to unleash hell. It was to be arguably the darkest, bloodiest time in world history. For the Normandie, this meant a somewhat less uncertain future, of course. She was officially seized by American authorities just days later on December 12th. A statute known as the Right of Angry dictated that the United States was within its rights to declare ownership of enemy property on its territory, and with the Normandie having not moved an inch since 1939, and the Vichy French now officially a belligerent nation, the ship was put squarely into American hands. But what to do with a ship like the Normandie? She was a powerhouse of a thing, and debates swirled around whether she would be more capable as a troop ship, an aircraft carrier, or even as an armed auxiliary cruiser. The most obvious choice would have been to convert her for troopship duties, much like her Cunard and French line counterparts had. But even once her conversion was underway, there was speculation that the plans might change, with some arguing that a single, well-placed torpedo could mortally wound the ship, thanks to the arrangement of her watertight compartments, and insisting she would be better suited as an aircraft carrier. And just to add more confusion to the matter, the New York Times was quick to erroneously print that the military had been in talks to see her converted to a raider. All this debate did very little to change the original plan. After a frustrating amount of back and forth, it was decided that the Normandie's future would look much like the ocean liners that had been caught in the crossfires of war before her. Britain was, simply put, in dire need of troops, and a ship with the capacity and speed of Normandy could alleviate this strain in just a single quick hop across the Atlantic. But she would need to be made ready very soon. The initial deadline given to complete that conversion was January 31st, and the ship would be ready for her first sailing on the 14th of February. This meant she would need to be stripped bare and completely fitted out for wartime duties, ready to be guided out of her berth just 5 weeks after her acquisition. This tight deadline highlighted two immediate glaring problems. The first being that it would require nothing short of a miracle to complete the conversion from the world's largest luxury liner to a Spartan troop ship, including all equipment and weapons called for by the military in that short time frame. But the second being possibly the most dire of the two. The Americans simply weren't familiar with their new ship to ensure that the conversion could be completed safely and efficiently. Nor, it appears, did they care enough to learn. While the French skeleton crew had taken the new American crew through the basics of running and maintaining her engines and given them a crash course in the ship's operation, almost all of the manuals, signs, labels, and written instructions on board were in French. and there simply wasn't enough time to deal with the language barrier or to learn the new ropes of an unfamiliar ship. The Americans were just going to have to do it the American way. Now, the first order of business would be to contract out the conversion work itself. Normandie had been built by the deft, skillful hands of the Atelier et Chantier de la Loire shipyard in Saint-Nazaire, France, and now she was to be ripped to shreds by the Robbins Dry Dock and Repair Company, a subsidiary of Todd Shipyards based in Brooklyn. Inelegant a solution though it was, the truth was that no shipyard or dry dock in New York was large enough to accommodate the massive liner, so she would need to stay at Pier 88 with workers coming to her instead. The decision to entrust the conversion of the majestic liner to an unheard-of third-rate shipyard was one of convenience, if not necessity, but there was no denying that it would be a far cry from the kid-glove treatment she had received at her dry dock back home. Before any work could begin in earnest, though, the ship would have to be gutted. By Christmas of 1941, the once palatial Normandie was swarmed with workers from the Chelsea Warehouse Company, eager to strip her bare and rinse her clean of everything that had once made her beautiful. 2,400 van loads of valuables were unloaded from the Normandie and put into storage, totaling between $6 to $8 million. Decor, fixtures, artwork, rugs, glass panels, and much of the rest of the ship's valuables were organised and stored away with care, but it would be a very long time before any of it saw the light of day again. Gone were the gilt panels, the sparkling illuminated columns, the statues, and the artwork. Even the famous sign beneath the ship's funnels bearing her name was pulled clean from the deck. There would be no longer any use for a sign bearing the name Normandie because now should be known as the USS Lafayette. It was of course important to make sure that the world's largest passenger ship would have adequate fire protection during the conversion. The French had seen to it that their elegant flagship was more than well equipped to deal with a fire at sea. On board, she was fitted with all the latest technology to prevent, detect and extinguish fires in short order. The ship featured an ultra-modern sprinkler system throughout, plus a state-of-the-art early detection system, fire doors, water pumps, 224 fire alarms and nearly 250 fire cupboards filled with all manner of firefighting equipment, plus 504 fire hose connections, and a direct line to the New York Fire Department right from her bridge. On board were 84 fire stations, which all needed to be patrolled and checked throughout the day. Each time a crew member passed a station, they pressed a button to light up a light corresponding to the station on the central control board. And once all 84 lights were lit, the new rotation began. For all intents and purposes, Normandie should have been a fireproof fortress. Unfortunately, all of this equipment can do very little to stop a fire without the crew members to man it. In the business, that's what we call foreshadowing. When occupied by her French crew, she was fully manned with 20 firemen. In American hands, this was reduced to 8, and many of those assigned to fire duties had received little to no firefighter training, and some never bothered to take part in fire drills and had never been assigned to fire stations at all. To make things even worse, her direct connections to the New York City Fire Department had been disabled during work on the bridge, and it was simply never repaired. In mid-January, Walter Kidd & Co. conducted a survey of the ship's firefighting equipment. Thoroughness was not the name of the game at this point for the Americans, and this survey amounted to checking 3 or 4 or more of the more than 600 fire extinguishers on board, noting that they would be ineffective, since they were not built to American specifications. It was recommended that all fire extinguishers be removed and replaced with their American counterparts, but no replacements ever arrived. It was also found that the ship would require fire hose couplings that could be compatible with American fire hoses. Though an effort was made to replace the couplings with compatible ones, the job was never finished, leaving the ship with a jumbled combination of American and French hose connections. As work progressed, every deck, public space, crew area and cabin was being swarmed with thousands of men working around the clock to complete the conversion work in short time. It wouldn't be enough to simply strip the Normandie to nothing and paint her grey. Bunks were needed to accommodate up to 14,800 troops. The dog kennel became an armoury, the children's playroom became the radar room, the lush and lively winter garden became a washroom, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bow were blacked out with sheet iron. Bars became troop canteens, the once luxurious dining saloon became a mess hall. All the pomp and splendour that made the Normandie a floating palace was now replaced with Spartan, utilitarian accommodations meant strictly for the theatres of war. Where the Normandy spirit once sang like a majestic chorus, the Lafayettes now seem to drone in bleak, marching cadence. But I guess that's war. Meanwhile, by the end of January, the deadline to complete all of this work was creeping closer by the second. Time was clearly not on the Navy's side. She was still due to sail on the 14th of February, and pleas made to the Bureau of Ships for an extension of just a few weeks were denied. If the scene aboard the Normandy had already been a disorganised mess, it was about to devolve into full-blown chaos. More people now flooded the decks of the Normandy than she had ever carried during her years of passenger service. Security became an almost comically impossible task, given that members of the military, surveyors and contractors from various companies, they were all coming and going around the clock with no way of vetting the legitimacy of anyone who stepped on board. This had actually been demonstrated rather elegantly in early January by a newspaper reporter named Edmund Scott, who'd been given one single assignment by his superiors at PM Newspaper: see if you can get on board the Normandy. Well, the report Scott later wrote for the newspaper wouldn't find its way to print, because it would leave America's newest and largest ship open to sabotage, but the story read, "For the last 2 days, I've been wandering all over the Normandy. I've been lighting imaginary fires, I've been planting imaginary bombs. I've succeeded in destroying, a dozen times over, the second biggest ship in the world." Normandy, it seemed, was impossible to secure. Coast Guardsman R.M. Epstein later said, "A handful of us were supposed to check thousands of workers. They wore buttons, Todd, Robbins, etc., but Christ, you could have worn a Mickey Mouse button and walked around." So went the final months of the Normandy's life. Keeping her safe stood secondary to making her fit for war. There was simply too much to be done in such a short amount of time, and the manpower needed to do it all created a security and logistics nightmare. By early February, 3,182 men were charged with various tasks aboard the Normandy, and amidst the cacophony of workers hammering, sawing, and welding their way through the ship, one task in particular had given the workers pause in the early days of conversion: the removal of the 4 towering column-light light fixtures mounted to the floor of the Grand Lounge. While they could easily remove the decorative glass that covered the fixtures, the stanchions or the poles that remained mounted to the floor would require an acetylene torch to take out. Now, with fire safety being paramount, it was initially decided that this would be too much of a hazard to attempt right away, and with more pressing matters at hand, the job was shelved for later. Dawn broke on February 9th, 1942. The Normandy would need to be made ready for war in under a week's time. Henry Minnickeen, who was the overseer of the Robbins dry dock workers on board, was tasked with assembling a team and devising a plan to finally remove those pesky metal stanchions from the Grand Lounge. The task itself was a fairly small, inconsequential one. Like much of the fixture removal around the ship, it was merely another box to be checked off on the to-do list. Minnickeen tapped Alphonsus Gately, the company's welding supervisor, to spearhead the job, who then pulled welder Clement Derrick from his task in the new water distilling plant, located in the area of the swimming pool on D-deck, and charged him with the task of cutting through the 4 stanchions using his welding torch. Derrick would be aided by 9 other workers who would each lend their skills to make sure the stanchions could be removed safely. He would be in charge of cutting through the steel columns while the rest of his cohort would man guide ropes to steadily lower the stanchions to the ground after they'd been completely cut through. All the while, fire watchers stood by, one man protecting the area with a metal shield, another holding a board made of asbestos above the shield to contain any errant sparks that may try to ricochet off, and there were buckets of water kept by as well to contain any flames that could erupt. The task wasn't overly complex, nor was it in any way much different from the hundreds of other similar welding tasks that had come before it. The men got to work, guiding the posts down as Derrick cut through them one by one, the fire watchers being careful to guard against the sparks emitting from the welder's torch. Save for one wayward ember that set a small piece of paper alight and was quickly extinguished, all went more or less according to plan. The workers came to cut the final stanchion. Once Derrick completed his cut, the stanchion would be guided to the ground by the workers and they could go on their merry way. As the welder went in to free the metal column from its base, 18-year-old Charles Collins, who'd been helping out with the asbestos shielding, saw something flash out of the corner of his eye. A spark from Derrick's torch had flown off and escaped the shields, landing on a nearby bale of life preservers, which all happened to be filled with kapok, a very buoyant, very light, but highly flammable material. Within seconds, the bale ignited. Collins hardly had time to react before the fire spread to the other nearby bales of life jackets. In total, over 1,400 of these extremely flammable things had been stacked in virtually every corner of the Grand Lounge, and soon they were being reduced to kindling for an out-of-control blaze. The workers sprang into action to contain the fire, beating at it with their coats, rugs, anything they could get their hands on. But sadly, for the Normandie, the fire was quickly spreading, and almost everything that played out after this point could only be described as a comedy of errors. Leroy Rose, another worker helping with the task, took it upon himself to retrieve the emergency water buckets nearby, but he immediately spilled one and accidentally poured the other on a fellow worker. Another worker valiantly attempted to toss away some of the bales, only to have one break open over a flame, sending burning life jackets raining down all over the place. 3 separate fire hoses were found to either not be functioning at all, or had American fittings that wouldn't fit with the French standpipes nearby. At the same time, a sailor pulled a fire extinguisher from a cabinet and attempted to use it to dampen the flames, only to find out he had no idea how to use it, and he quickly gave up on the idea altogether. Within just a couple of minutes, flames were now eating their way through the entirety of the Normandie's Grand Lounge, and the men on board were simply too poorly trained and ill-equipped to stop it. They needed help, and fast. A member of the fire watch team telephoned the bridge, alerting the Coast Guardsman stationed there of the blaze, and begging him to notify the fire department via the direct line on the bridge, but then ineptitude struck once again. This, of course, was the line that had been disabled early in the conversion, and it had never been reconnected. The fire would have a 12 full minutes of eating the Normandie from the inside out, nearly unabated before the New York City Fire Department was even notified. Finally, a sailor ran down the gangway in a panic, alerting a passing police officer who was able to activate the nearby fire alarm on the pier. Within just 3 minutes, fire trucks began descending on the pier, their sirens wailing, their men scrambling to deploy fire hoses and find their way aboard the burning ship. At the same time, Henry Minikeen had taken to the ship's loudspeaker system to announce that there was a fire on board, and he called for an immediate full evacuation. With this announcement, thousands of workers ran for the hills almost as one, choking the same gangways that firefighters were now trying to enter through. Even men who'd been helping to fight the fire abandoned their posts, leaving the blaze to devour almost anything and everything in its path. Any hope of an orderly evacuation gave way to all-out chaos. Men justifiably scrambled to escape the labyrinthine ship, their vision clouded by thick smoke. Some, who'd been working as painters on the upper decks, managed to lower and launch a lifeboat, and others managed to escape by lowering themselves down the lifeboat's falls. All told, 200 men were injured during the panic that ensued, and one man even lost his life. While chaos reigned above, the situation down in the engine room was precarious for an entirely different reason. Despite smoke quickly filling the Normandie's massive machine spaces, much of the machinery was still switched on and functioning to supply the ship with power, water and ventilation, all of which would still be needed while firefighting operations were underway. It simply couldn't be left to run unattended. But ultimately, the engineering staff on board from the Navy and the Coast Guard ordered the machinery shut down and the furnaces banked, leaving Normandy with enough reserved steam power for another 15 or 20 minutes. It was hoped that this would be long enough to get the fire under control. About 20 minutes after the fire had broken out, the first fireboat arrived alongside Normandie to assist. The James Duane began hosing down the Normandie's port side and her upper decks, and it was joined shortly afterwards by the John J. Harvey and the comically named Firefighter. Meanwhile, firemen on board worked their way through her interiors and starboard side, each racing to contain the out-of-control blaze. Another fireboat, the Hewitt, joined the fray, and the 4 small vessels began effectively pelleting the liner's port side with a deluge of water. But, as the port promenade deck flooded with water from the fireboats, molten lead from melting electrical conduits began to slowly leak down, and then re-solidify around the drainage scuppers on the deck, rendering them useless. Rather than safely draining, the water on Normandie's port side began to build up. The water from the fire hoses on land couldn't possibly keep up with the flood overtaking her port side. Before long, the Normandie began to list. As efforts to extinguish the flames intensified, so did the raging inferno, fed continuously by bales of life preservers, mattresses, paint cans, insulation, and all manner of flammable materials left scattered throughout the ship. By this point, smoke could be seen blocks and blocks away as far as Times Square. Traffic nearby slowed to a crawl as onlookers took in the hellish scene unfolding before them. Crowds began to form near Pier 88, watching in awe as the grand ship whose silhouette had adorned the waterfront for over 2 years was engulfed in flames. Among them was none other than Vladimir Yorkovich, the very man who'd helped design the Normandie, and he had a plan that could help save her. He knew the location of the seacocks that could be opened, to release water and help reverse the Normandie's list, but despite his repeated pleas, he was denied access. His heart broken, all he could do was return home and watch out his window as his creation slowly died before his eyes. By 3:15, just around 45 minutes since the outbreak of the fire, Normandie's upper works had been all but consumed. At the same time, the last of the steam in her boilers had finally run out. The ship went dark. The Normandie was now unable to run the pumps providing water for fire hoses, as well as the ship's advanced Horowitz plumbing system, which had been helping to drain some of the excess water from the fireboats. She was now little more than a flooded, burning out hulk. Spurned on by the deluge from the fireboats, her list increased. By 3:40, she was tilted so severely that her gangways were ripped from the side of the pier, just as Mayor LaGuardia had some of the top Navy brass attempting to climb aboard to assess the damage, and nearly knocked them into the dock. Tugboats were ordered to help pull Normandie back onto an even keel, at least temporarily, and there was an attempt to flood the forward hold to settle the ship's bow into the silt to hold her steady, but it was becoming increasingly clear that while the Normandie couldn't burn forever, she was in very real danger of just completely keeling over. There needed to be a quick plan in place to right her, or the ship would be a total loss. Like badly programmed NPCs in a video game, the fireboats continued their relentless downpour of water. Tens of thousands of tons of water flooded the decks of the dying Normandie, and all attempts at draining the water proved fruitless. The ship's list was now 11 degrees. Eventually, the idea was floated to call off the fireboats entirely, but with the fire still raging on board, it was thought it would be more prudent to continue fighting to contain the blaze. In the meantime, 2 more fireboats arrived on scene and began attacking the flames with gallon upon gallon of water, all pouring into the port side of the ship. At the same time, an all-new spanner was thrown into the works. High tide would be rolling in at around 4:49 PM, and the ship would inevitably shift its position as water rushed into the dock. There were 2 possible outcomes: either she would right herself, or she would keel right over without the support of the silt beneath her. The tide came in, and for a moment, it seemed the ship would hold steady, but then, little by little, she leaned over. By 5 PM, the Normandie's list had increased to 15 degrees. The thick mooring lines snapped. The gangway was pulled again from the pier. It became evident that the torrent of water from the fireboats was now doing more damage than the fire itself. It was finally time to call them off. Fire Chief Geller gave the signal to the fireboats to cease operations. Minutes passed, but the deluge still continued. Over an hour later, the ship was still being inundated on her port side, and the fireboats had clearly missed the signal or elected to just ignore it. Finally, Mayor LaGuardia took it upon himself to relay the message directly to the boats via radio telephone. The fireboats were to cease pumping immediately, and slowly but surely, the downpour slowed to a trickle. Without the fireboats inundating the ship, her list seemed to hold at 15 degrees. Some good news arrived finally at 6:30 when it was declared that the fire was under control. The crowd began to thin, but many could hardly turn their gaze from the precariously leaning 80,000-ton ship. Evening came, and the discussion turned to how to finally right the ship now that the fire was contained. All other methods had proven fruitless so far, but without the roaring blaze and torrential downpour from the fireboats to contend with, authorities were hopeful they could come up with a viable solution. A new plan emerged to pump some of the water from within the ship using 12 250-gallon-per-minute home-light pumps provided by the fire department, but the plan fell apart when it was found that the pumping pressure couldn't be maintained across the long distance between the ship's interior spaces and the viable exits, like portholes. It was back to the drawing board. At the same time that attempts to correct Normandie's list were repeatedly failing, Admiral Adolphus Andrews was busy giving a press conference, updating the media on the situation at Pier 88. When asked by a reporter if the ship was in danger of capsizing, he replied, "At this point, I doubt it. Her list has only increased 1 degree or so over the last few hours. Still, there are the tides to worry about. Low tide is at 10:37. If there's no further list then, I think she's safe." Just as predicted, low tide arrived at 10:37. 3 feet of water retreated from beneath the Normandie, and burnt out, flooded and terribly off balance, the ship groaned, seemingly out of exhaustion, before her list increased to 20 degrees. From a distance, she looked like a thing defeated, a mortally wounded giant in its final moments, desperate to roll over and sleep one last time. Shortly after midnight, the list had increased to 25 degrees. At this point, it was no longer safe to stay on board. Admiral Andrews gave the order to finally abandon ship, ending the work of those inside who were still fighting to save the once proud vessel. Later, when asked again if he thought the ship might completely heel over, Andrews simply shrugged, and then when pressed, flippantly replied that he doubted it. As if in response, at that same moment, the Normandie lurched again, her port side seeming to reach to kiss the water's surface. Her list had increased to 33 degrees. By now, the sounds of crashing could be heard from within, as everything not bolted down, from her furniture to scaffolding to the same firefighting gear used to try to save her, went careening into the ship's port side. It was no longer an if, but a when. The Normandie was dying. Then, at 2:37 a.m., after 12 hours of fighting for her survival, the Normandie gave up. She rolled pathetically and almost silently onto her port side, exhausted and lifeless. She was gone. What was once the epitome of French grandeur and style now had little in common with the capsized hulk laying pitifully there on her side. As morning commuters set off on their way to work, none could resist slowing down to gawk at the strange and grim sight. Office workers took in the view from skyscrapers high over the city, and some 30,000 more spectators arrived at the dock to marvel at what remained of the ship that just 24 hours ago had been standing proud in the very same spot. Much like the hulk of the Morro Castle 8 years before, the lifeless corpse of the Normandie now became a waterfront tourist attraction, driving crowds to her berth, just as she had in her final years spent decorating the New York harbour. An investigation into the loss of the ship was immediately launched, because many suspected German sabotage was to blame. But in the end, the Normandie was found to be a victim of pure and utter incompetence and carelessness. Those who had been entrusted with the grandest ship afloat seemed to do everything in their power to see her come to ruin. And once the blaze had been reduced to a smoulder and the ship reduced to a husk, it would seem they had succeeded with flying colours. Now, they had a bigger problem. It would take about a year and a half before salvage operations could get underway. Ultimately, in August 1943, an extensive and costly operation was completed to right the ship. The task took 16 months and cost upwards of $5 million, making it the most expensive operation of its kind undertaken in history. And in the end, it was actually successful. The Normandie was able to stand up on her own proverbial 2 feet once again. It was hoped that she could be repaired and maybe used as an aircraft and transport ship, but once inspected, it became quickly clear that the damage incurred by her hull was simply too great. In September 1946, what remained of the Normandie was finally sold for scrap. By the final day of 1948, the last pieces of her hull were cut away, and she was no more. By the end of the whole saga, the Normandie had actually spent more time sitting idle in New York, or as a burnt-out hulk on the river, than she ever did as a functioning passenger liner. She'd happily plied the waves of the Atlantic for 4 years in her early life, but her career had essentially ground to a halt when she arrived in New York on September 3rd, 1939. Once there, she would live out the rest of her days as a stationary fixture of the waterfront, a pale imitation of the record-breaking queen of the seas she was intended to be. To this day, there are question marks around the ideas of sabotage from German agents, keen to deny the enemy a chance at putting into action their new megaship. But all told, Normandy was just another victim of history's most destructive war. For many, the loss of the liner was an era-defining moment, because it was clear that there would never again be another ship as grand as Normandy. Her death was avoidable, as it was painful, brought on by a series of errors fueled by hubris and exacerbated by carelessness. Though she'd been born of brilliance and built to redefine elegance, the sea would never again bear witness to the splendour and sparkle that had once been the ship of light, the magnificent SS Normandie.